do that. Now, on the tax side, it seems we've done a lot. Finance bill after finance bill and other laws that have come on board. But a question seems to be, are we managing our spending? And why do we seem to be struggling to do that? So over to you, Kwame.
All right. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for this invitation. So I think the question is, we've talked about the last 10 years. Tax collections have been growing, or government revenues have been growing at 10% every year. And as Abraham correctly mentioned, few people get a raise in your income of 10% every year for 10 straight years. That's a lot. That means basically your income has doubled and you have another 50% on top of it. That's really, really high. So it's telling you that if you have this amount of money and it's growing, why are you running a deficit, or why do you run into a debt problem? It means your expenditures are growing at a faster rate. And it means two things. You can decide that 10% growth in income per year is not enough, or you can decide that the rate at which we are spending is also too high. It's one or the other, or both. The government of Kenya seems to lean on raising more taxes. And I think that's an easy thing if you think it's mechanical. You raise more taxes, incomes are going to come. But if you remember last year, in trying to raise an additional 230 billion, we nearly broke the country. So it's telling you that on the part of the people who are paying, they are telling you this pain has gone too far. Because now you're asking us to pay you and we're not able to eat. So I think there's a natural check to how much government can say, this is what we want to spend because we are taking the money off your pockets. We are raising taxes, we are raising borrowing, and we're also raising at the same time our spending. So the point was, in the protests and some of those sad events, what Kenyans were saying is, this is going too far. You're going beyond how much incomes we are comfortable to give. And there's no science around taxes in terms of the collection. It is what society agrees we should pay. And it looks like there's a stop last year. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I'd say is that I think we ought to win government and ourselves as people who comment on taxes and spending of the view that a government with more money, a rich government, is a good one. There's no truth in that. It's just a preference. Because government doesn't have its own money per se, except for what it claims from other people's income. Whether it's income, VAT, all those other things that government needs to do. So I think that's the basic thing. But as I stop, it means that the fiscal consolidation, which has been leaning heavily on more revenue collection, is coming a cropper. If you look at the last, and John Badi has been out there every day saying that, look, when they passed after the finance bill failed and they brought the tax amendments law, the expectation was that they'd raise about 140 billion or thereabouts, slightly less. And what they'd raised was just about 40. So less than 1/3 of what was expected. So it's telling you that there's a certain limit to how much taxes you can squeeze out of Kenyan households and Kenyan farms. And that's the reality we need to face. How you bring back spending is a question of discipline. So I'll give two examples and then I'll shut up. One of the first ones is, I personally don't believe that the government of Kenya employs 1 million people. I don't believe it. I really don't believe it. There are just some people who are probably there because their ID is in a HR office and they are paid a salary, but they actually don't exist and don't exist. So the first thing is just to ask ourselves, how do we make sure we are paying people who are showing up or really work for the public sector? That's the first one. And I'm talking about both national government and the county governments. They are just, I don't believe those numbers. 900,000 people, I don't believe it. As a matter of fact, I don't believe that there are 40,000. I don't believe that there are 400,000 teachers teaching children in Kenyan schools. I don't believe it. So something about those numbers need to be cleaned out fast. That's the first one. And that ought not to be difficult. It doesn't mean you're cutting. It simply means you're actually disciplining the number of people who work. Would savings come from that? I suspect a lot. So that's the first. And the second, the government of Kenya...
A question I will throw to you is, how different should we do it? And what criteria do you think the government can adopt to make sure that we live within our means? because that seems to be the headache. Living within our means, and I like something Kwame has said, we should not be envious of a rich government, because so we want also to be able to make sure that we are managing how much the government is collecting. So when it comes to the spending, what do you think we need to have as a criteria that ensures we live within our means?
Thanks, John. First of all, it's great to be back here. I think we were of allocations of money that's going towards different things. And of course, a big culprit of this happens to be the education sector, where there are bursaries and scholarships for every county almost every county government. Even beyond the education sector, some of the research we've been doing at Budgeti Hub actually indicates that there's bursaries outside of the education sector. So for example, in the social protection sector, the Office of the President actually has its own bursaries for secondary school students. They're often vulnerable children. So one of the things that we could explore in terms of prioritization is how do we see where county governments have an agriculture function that county government is supposed to have. So to do with, are those needs and values, do they have a space to be expressed, right? So is there public participation that allows for the government to actually grasp these different needs and aspirations? But also, as citizens, are we actually taking advantage of the information, of the opportunities that are there for us to engage, so that the government is actually aware of our priorities and are involved in that?
It also affects the rate of disbursement of the equitable share that comes to the counties. But secondly, we cannot finalize that discussion without holding them to account. What are you doing with the money that we have, even in the constrained fiscal space that we are encountering in the country? The second thing is to also ask, what can we do with the revenues that we collect locally as OSR? Can we use that to be able to meet part of the services that we provide? Because Article 175 states that county
shillings, or rather almost 4 billion USDs in an annual basis to grow, to bring our infrastructure to a modernized state, and to make sure that our people are enjoying the services as of in the developed country. But for us to do that, our resources are limited, and you see what we can collect as local revenue is as much. We cannot meet that development deficit. So the fact is that for us to develop, we need resources, and that's why we've been unable to match our development budget to the required tunes. So that's where the private sector comes in. Private sector has it's efficient, it invests. They say it's not the business of government to do business, but rather to create that conducive environment where business, through policy, through legislation, to make sure that business thrives. And hence the business doing business, the fact is that the private sector is efficient, unlike government. There's a lot of wastage, there's a lot of inefficiencies in government. And that's why, first of all, to bridge that gap, the government enters through specific projects through public-private partnership. There's a bit that public guarantees. There's a bit that the private sector, especially financing, that comes to it. Again, another fact is that the business interest is in return on investment, but the government interest is provision of service. So we need to come up to an agreement for a project to be viable to the private sector. There needs to be, demonstration that this project will be able to repay the private investments that the private sector is putting into to support government to do that which it meant to do. So I think there's a place for specific projects that are capital, and most of the times the projects are capital intensive and require so much that a government with limited fiscal space cannot be able to provide. And that's as you the rest have said, we have very little space for us to input into development and to survive. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I let you go, so because of the current debt position of the country, And here I'm taking a very wide look at it, not just Kenyan private companies, but also just globally. How attractive is Kenya for such kind of projects to the private sector, from where you sit?
Well, Kenya has a growing middle class, hence, and that's why I think even the president keeps saying, you know, kuna watu wakona pay slips, ndio. Watu wakona pay slip, they need to saidia mama mboga tuwatoe hapa chini tuwalete hapa jesio. So I think Kenya, we have, first of all, our resilient nature. Our economy has largely been resilient over time, despite the very many shocks that continue to face it. So our people, our populace are largely educated. Our literacy levels are at least above most across Africa, and our potential is largely huge if we're able to put it into, you know, so we have the potential to attract private credit. Our manufacturing sector, even though has been on the dip, but it has a great potential. Our natural resource is sufficient, and if it can be you know, produced optimally, we're able to generate more and even repay. But there are quite a number of inefficiencies. I think Kwame has always been talking about it, that you enable productive our
of reliance on the payslip and the question of the social contract is, to my mind, quite simply a lack of imagination. It's the simplest way to just smash and grab whatever is in our pockets and dash away. Because from what I gather from last year's conversation, you keep hearing the word patriotism being dropped around very strategically. Yet, what we can see right now is that our patriotism has been eroded simply because of this idea that people with pay slips must be paid. Yet there are a whole bunch of other issues. For instance, when we talk of non-tax revenue, the question of licenses and how the money that goes to those licenses or anything that we buy, for instance, I don't know whether the mystery around the money we pay for the certificate of good conduct has ever been sorted, and things like that. The licenses about Kanjo and all that. These are other sources that should be considered. But to say that pay slips will pay for everything essentially just erodes that conversation. So there are a lot of other aspects. So as I've said, there is licensing. There is questions like tax expenditures. So once you have that conversation, what are we giving away and what are we gaining? But essentially, because from the point of the question of tax governance, the idea of inequality as a function of unfairness and political dominance of one group or economic or other has to now extend to the question that as we talk about these things, how do we sort out inequality by addressing the question of productivity? Again, another linkage. Nyamai told us here in the morning of her business. This is a big problem in this country. Productivity is not happening. Businesses are not growing. Or those that are in existence are essentially walking a slow death to lack of or provision of revenues. And so I think on the question of the social contract, as I've just kind of connected the dots, we have to now think of productivity, and taxation should just spread all that. even if we are thinking of, for instance, expanding the tax base, you have to expand it through not the pay slips alone, but also the informal sector. But that return on investment has to happen, which isn't happening a lot of the times. Thank you.
Thank you. And I like the fact that you started with that social contract aspect, the relationship between the state and citizens and what the incentive is to raise more from the same public. And I think it brings a big question about the value for money and whether people feel that they are getting value for the shilling they give. And last year, at one point, ARA were doing a roadshow, going around the country, encouraging all of us to be good taxpayers, take advantage of the waiver that was there. And one person said, actually, you should not come marketing to us how we should properly file our taxes and how to use items. It should actually help us to see that the money you collected from me last year actually provided a good service. If you do that, I'll be willing to pay more taxes. And one of the things that the government has said to do, and said we've already started doing, is a focus on what they are calling zero-based budgeting. And this now has been thrown. For those of you who have looked at the budget policy statement, you have worked by the CS for the National Treasury and Planning. It's spoken a lot about zero budgeting as this thing now that they are doing that will help manage how expenditure is happening. Kwame, is zero-based budgeting the dream we've been waiting for to make sure there is value for money?
Alright.
Sorry, and please, you can start explaining what zero-based budgeting is.
Okay. Now, so why it's
Up and it was approved in the cabinet level was this shift from the kind of accounting system we use as a country. And I'll start with you, Cuba, but Onami also has to speak to it. So in this effort to deal with pending bills, which are quite significant at the national and the county level, then the government is looking to change how it does its accounting and hoping that that will kind of minimize the challenges that we have with the pending bills, because then they're kind of a dragging debt that we have to consider when we are doing our budget. So this adoption of this accrual system of accounting, Cuba, does it help us reduce a bit of that elephant in the room? Or are we trying to solve bad manners with a technical thing?
Thanks, John. I think the accumulation of pending bills is primarily a behavioral issue. It's part of it is a manifestation of the cash basis method of accounting that we've been using, and we'll get into that. But I think fundamentally it's a thing of intention to pay. So, for example, if you came here via Boda Boda and you agreed on the price, you're going to pay 150 shillings, and it comes to the end of the trip and you tell him, I'm not going to pay, I'll pay you maybe tomorrow, right? And you keep doing that for all other things, that maybe services you may consume or you may end up procuring. It's a behavioral thing, right? But how accrual accounting will come into the picture is that it'll just make it a bit more visible, make the bad behavior a bit more visible. So how we currently account for our finances, or for when government procure services, is we do it on a cash basis, which basically means that the record of the transaction, let's say the government wants to buy this block, for example, the transaction for the government to procure that is only recorded when the money moves. Right? So if you think of a transaction as having 3 basic steps, you make the order is delivered, you pay, right? So in the current system, you only record the transaction at the last part when you pay. That means that, for example, if it's a county government, they can make an order to purchase this box, the box is delivered, and they say we're going to pay, and they say we're going to pay in a number of months, right? We'll pay you tomorrow. So in the system, that unsettled financial obligation is not visible. It only becomes recorded once the payment is made, once the cash moves. Now with accrual accounting, the transaction is recorded as and when it happens, right? So even if you tell someone, I'm going to pay you later, at least there's a record that you're supposed to pay someone later, right? So the problem that we have now, and it's a reason why a lot of the measures that have been presented is around getting this, people to verify pending bills, is because there's no record of, it's not visible, like these financial obligations. So that's why you had this pending bills verification committee, which basically had the job of sorting through all of these unsettled financial obligations and seeing which ones are legitimate and which ones are not, right? Because for you to become a pending bill, in the sense that you're a legitimate pending bill, you have to meet a certain amount of criteria, certain criteria. So what the accrual accounting is actually going to do, it's going to make a lot of the behavior a lot more visible. We're going to be able to see, the true extent of pending bills in Kenya. And I think it's interesting, one of these, actually I think all of these blocks have a key budget document that's listed here. One of the documents is actually a county debt management strategy paper. And one of the things I've been thinking about is, should we include pending bills as part of the debt conversation, right? Because with this this greater visibility, I think we'll be able to see to a great extent what debts it is that county governments have, national governments have, state corporations have, which will allow them for a better calculation into the debt stock that Kenya has, in terms of our borrowing. So it's a nice thing. It's something that's been introduced in a number of countries, but fundamentally we have a problem. We have a behavior of not paying things when we're supposed to, and that still needs to be solved.
Well, thank you so much, and Cuba. I think that's very good demystifying what the accounting concept of it. But generally, it's a bill, the pending bill, the way it you all know how government budgeting process happens. And I think as you look in front here, you see the entire process. The budget has been approved for spending. And because we approved so much budget, we had and we see we had so much to raise to meet our budgets. So most often, whatever we say we will raise, we do not raise. So it becomes like we do not have enough money to meet all the obligations, first of all, that we said we are going to meet in a year. Second thing, using and servicing the government. When government cuts spending, generally it trickles down that you see the private sector will suffer. First of all, the supplies to government, definitely in government providing services, they spend a lot from private sector allocation. So generally, spending will trickle down to the private sector as well. But and that actually just signals, because money, the way money circulates. If you see a government has done exchequer release, and there's money in the county, you'll feel it, yeah, in the expenditure across businesses, across everyone was happy when the government is spending, but spending in the right way. Again, it just signals.
Well, I disagree fundamentally with the idea. Completely. I mean, you'd be rewriting economics textbooks to say something like that. So for this reason, let me tell you why. If you look at the Kenyan economy, for every 100 shillings produced in the Kenyan economy per year, 23% is government. It means most of the economy is actually private. So that's very, very important. That's first. So the idea that if government spends, private sector gains, some private sector gains. But it can also be private sector outside the country when they're sending boxes of dollars to Dubai. So we have to be very careful when we say stuff like that. So that's the first point. That's a very, very bad analogy about how an economy works. And the second one is this. Government does not have its own money. So before government spends, it has to take taxes from you. So for instance, if government spends less and leaves me with a higher money, so for instance, on the housing levy, for instance, right? If government did not take that 2.5% or whatever it is from each of every one of you, that money would be available for you to either save, which means it would be lent over to somebody else to create business and all that. the only justification in the economics textbook for government spending are the things that if government did not do, then nobody else would do them, such as security. So that justifies government spending. But the idea that if government spends, it helps some private sector, especially private sector that likes hotels or likes certain things or likes helicopters and all that. But the idea that every government spending is necessarily a good thing is completely anti what you find in the economics textbooks. Government spending can also be useful when there is a recession. So for instance, if there are no jobs and for some reason people are not working, which is what happened, they say, during COVID, then you can justify government spending because people have tools, they have factories, but they are idle. That can be spent. But do not believe this circular argument. It is actually a lie. I'm sorry to have to say that. It is not true that government does. There are only certain things that government would spend on. I'll end with this. Remember that everybody who receives money in government, even as a taxpayer, as a worker, be it the president all the way down to the teacher in a primary school in my shads, right? They are net receivers of government money, of public money. In other words, other people have to pay taxes so that government can collect and pay them. That's why when government does not, even pensioners who had received their money and saved it are now 3 months behind. Please don't believe that. It's not true. It isn't. It would be anathema for me as a student of economics, and I'm a simple one, to actually have the public do that. Because what it means mathematically is, then all of us should become employees at government so that it pays us and we pay it back. And you see how absurd that would be? Thank you.
Thanks, Kwame, for that. So the last question, I'll pose it to Leonard. So often you hear this conversation about how, because at the end of the day, we are looking at this also in the long term, right? So we know it will take time to get out of the debt situation we are in and the fiscal challenges we are in. So when we look in the long term, a big part of the conversation is focused on how do we get the country growing, especially the private side of it, growing enough so that there's not as much dependence on government for certain things. And I think I keep hearing is this bit of, we need to move from being very agricultural, we become a bit more into manufacturing, and when we do well in manufacturing, then you can grow into the services. There's a lot of that language, right, that sometimes is thrown at us. And one of the things that you see Kenya doing in this effort to become a manufacturing hub is a lot of these special economic zones and what have you that are being created all over the place. The goal remains the same, is that the country needs also to grow its economy from one level to another level. From a perspective of where you sit, right, in terms of what the government is trying to do, which is raise more revenue, are we approaching this in the right way? Because when you look at the economic survey, the share of contribution of the manufacturing sector, it's not headed in the direction we think it should. So what is not adding up? Because I was shocked the other day to learn that Two Rivers is a special economic, so I never knew that. So it seems they are everywhere. So what is the connection and what is the disconnect?
Thanks. And to pick up the conversation from where Kwame actually raised, that disconnect is essentially a disruption of logic, if you ask me. Because when things like EPZs, SEZs, those are exclusive zones to attract investment and then probably get the growth that is estimated. But when I said it's a disruption of logic, if you look, if just hearing what Kwame talked about, the 23% and the 70%, you need to be helping these 70 shillings to be productive. And that's why I clearly said there's a disruption in productivity. So the thing you're talking about, transformation from one sector into another, can't happen if we still have this idea of dependency on government activities. It can't happen. As of right now, the things that would interest me is talking about how to change agricultural production in the sense that you're converting a 1 acre farmer into a small business. Hence the language of agribusiness. How do you change him from an agribusiness first bringing them into agribusiness, because it's essentially an informal sector, majority informal sector. So just making a business out of agriculture. If it grows enough, put in manufacturing in there. So if I'm planting some crop, how do I make it a business? Through contracts and so forth, so that you have regular revenues. If I want to process my crop into now something that I can sell in a supermarket, give them the incentives to get small micro factories or micro engines and all that. And then from there, once you're selling a processed product, you have the finances and you'll have a whole sector around it. So then you can start talking about a financial sector. And then as you increase, you can talk about now the digitization. So essentially, the chain is broken because we are setting up a system of dependence and it is not productive. So at this point in time, every year when I see or something about shrinking agricultural productivity, I know we are still in the same problem. It doesn't matter if you bring the biggest, fanciest factory or industrialist from wherever, but if the agricultural industry is not absorbing all these young people coming out of school and whatnot, then we are lying to ourselves. So that transformation happens with kind of ending that disruption. Now, what essentially worries me in this whole thing is this disruption is creating kind of new spaces of capture. The conversation I had about the ownership of the digital services in this country is really worrying me, because what we are doing is creating a new barony in the digital space. So the problem that we have been doing about captured land, captured jobs, is now moving into a captured internet, right? Secret techies, wasiri wa teknolojia, who are now essentially unknown to us. So we are extending the problem. And so my worry is we are getting ourselves stuck rather than moving ourselves out of the problem, because the same behavior is now essentially moving from agriculture. It has moved to manufacturing. It has moved to banking and circles now, same problems. And in the digital space, again, we are going to have the same problems, where the people we don't know who are controlling things are just going to have a free way to move money out of systems into boxes that you're saying are going to Dubai and so forth. And we are just increasing the problem. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So a clap for my panel, please. So the MC has been very clear with me that time is up. But since I have the microphone, I will take the power and ask whether there is... okay. Probably I was not going to say if you have a question. Okay. So if you have a really burning question, and please, Kenyans, you cannot start with, mine is not a question. Mine is a... Please don't do that. So the MC will just move around very quickly. 2, maximum 3 questions. Sharp, targeted. If you want them answered by somebody on the panel, please direct it. But let's have very quick ones.
One.
And I like it's only ladies who have their hands up. That's really nice. MC, I will leave it to you to choose.
Okay, I have a question. I'm a village
Your name,
person.
please. Your name,
I'm
please.
Kerubo. I'm representing the Lake Region AB. So my question is a village question. There's this issue of public debt. So every year in out, we have this public debt. So my question is this. So for me, if I have a person, I'm borrowing money every year and he is not returning that money to me, so next time I won't give him that money, because there is no way I'll use my money and I wait for years, like 10 years, 20 years, still my money, I'm not getting it back. So my question is something hidden to those who are borrowing money to Kenya? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. So my name is Violet Mbiti, representing the Nairobi Eastern Central Budget Hub. So my question is basically on pending bills. So in the budget policy statement, they stated that counties owe 189 billion as pending bills, and this also includes money owed to KEMSA by counties, and that is why there is no medicines even in public health facilities. So I wanted to ask, this question is directed to the panel. Whoever will answer. So are there any systemic financial challenges within the counties that makes it difficult to clear this debt? Because Senate recommended the counties that they should pay at least 1 billion per year, but they are not obeying the Senate. So what are the systemic challenges, financial challenges? Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Now now that we are from the Senate, wacha tukuje huku National Assembly. Tusikie mheshimiwa kutoka kaunti gani?
Good afternoon. My name is Meshak Stephen Lokanjo. I am graduate from University of Nairobi. I did economics and statistics. My question is directed to the economist Kwame Owino. Is Kenya debt trajectory sustainable under the current fiscal consolidation framework? And lastly, how do you assess the risk of over-reliance on debt to finance public expenditure?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please allow me to stop it there, so that we don't take all the time for the other panel. So Kwame, at least there's one question directed to you. Are we out of the trend mill yet? Are we headed in the right direction?
Well, so far, I mean, the biggest achievement we had last year was that there was no default. So it looks like we're okay. But there are certain other payments that are coming over time. And what we are seeing right now is government has announced a certain number of deals. You remember the swap deal, which is basically borrowing money so that you can pay off one debt and then buy yourself some time. So it's buying time. And so we'll have to observe again. Now, the other thing is if you have a debt at the level at which Kenya has, not everything is in your hands. If something happens globally, for instance, as happened during COVID, the COVID year, 2020, and happened towards the beginning of last year, it can actually upset your global conditions, which make it difficult for you to get other money, or if you have a shock in Kenya where growth reduces. So the good assumption is that if we're recovering and growth continues, that's it. So better than last year, but certainly for me, we are not out of the woods yet. Debt, public debt, is a sensible way of adding to the delivery of public goods for governments, but it has to be sensible. I say sensible. But the huge expansion that the government of Kenya started in 2013, where we were buying anything. We were buying trains, we were buying expressways, we were buying stadiums, just about everything. That is just I mean, developing a country is a difficult thing. So as I sit here, I'm not saying that it's easy, but it requires people who are sane, who look like adults and not children with a credit card going into a candy store. Thank you.
Thank you. I will keep that last statement. I'll use it somewhere. Cuba, Kerubo asked an interesting question. There are these people we've borrowed money from, and we've been with their money for a very long time. Is there something that we are not being told about this debt that seems to just be around? And now all of us have been saying how we are going to be in this mess for very many years. What is it about this debt?
Thanks, Unique. So two important things to remember. One is that debt contracts can be often over a long period, right? So you go from something short to something like treasury bills, which can be even 1 year, that you have to pay back, the repayment period. Or you could go into something like maybe the SGR, which may be 20, 30-year contract. So the payment of that debt happens gradually over time, which is the second point, which is that if you look at the number, the actual number, 10 trillion, 11 trillion, it may not change much over time, especially in a short period of time. But in reality, what happens is there's a lot of movement. So each year, the government actually pays debts actively, right? At least we'd like to think so. So for example, in the coming financial year, we're supposed to spend about 1.6 trillion on debt payments, which is about 4.4 billion a day, something like that. But at the same time, we are going to be borrowing 800 billion. So you can see that we brought it down by 1.6, but then, increasing it by 8 again. So generally, you'd expect that over time, public debt decreases. And I think we saw a dip even last year once we paid our Eurobond, which was $2 billion, right? Over 300 billion shillings. And you'd find that when we paid that debt, our debt went down by a certain amount. But over time, as we continued to borrow, it went up again. And a very recent example is like last year, we paid that Eurobond for 2 billion. And we immediately took out a Eurobond and then paid back the old one. Right? We paid back one of about 2 billion and we took another one of 1.5. Right? So the debt has actually only gone down by 0.5. So it's important to realize that these are things are paid actively, but we're also borrowing actively. So over time, the number might not change much. But it's a great question.
Okay. Then the very last one, I think, Onami, since spending bills. So there's a question about, what the Senate said in terms of requiring that counties settle pending bills. It seems not to be happening. And so I think the back end of that question is, what exactly needs to play out for those pending bills to be settled? I see a friend of mine here who is a director of budget from one of the counties. I will not put him on the spot to answer that question. So Nami today will answer that question.
Thank you so much, Violet, for that question. I think there was established a pending bills verification committee that are since led by the former Auditor General Edward Ouko, and counties were owing about 168, but generally they are about 665 billion worth of pending bills. So what needs to happen, I think, because they were not factored in the current budget year, the National Treasury committed to do a supplementary budget to clear those verified pending bills and allocate and apportion accordingly, some to the county government and other to national government agencies, which we hope that now that they have been verified and the budget provision is made through the supplementary budget, those will be a thing of the past. And again, we hope, and like any other exchequer release, it's been faced by a challenge in collection. So as long as our cash flow continue to carry not meeting the targets, then I think we continue to face the same physician circle, meeting the current need versus paying, what the outstanding bills as well. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So we'll end our session there. So thank you very much again to the team that put this session together, and to Budget Global. Thank you very much. And for my panelists, asanteni sana.
We'll have a group photo for the panel. Let's appreciate the panelists. Tupigeni makofi bwana. Hapa juu. Photographers? Is that okay? Aha. Finya. Cuba finya kidogo. Aha. Hapo iko sawa?